we talk about here in this alliterative way, using the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, about the realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. So it's, the very first one is just how widespread trauma is. And at the same time, and what I really have held for many, many years, working with both shock trauma and developmental trauma, that recovery is always possible, no matter how traumatized a person's been. Now, obviously, when we're talking about some of the things at the extreme end of the spectrum, it can be very slow and it can be very challenging, but there's always the possibility of healing for reasons that I'll go deeper into later. So the next element is to recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system. This is really important. I was part of a study where we basically the orientation was to reach out to both uh, pediatricians and primary care professionals because they're often on the front lines of recognizing childhood, particularly childhood developmental trauma. And, that's just one group of professionals that I've personally been involved with in reaching out to and helping them to recognize the early signs because they're in a position to see it earlier than many other people often are. Uh, so it's, this ability to recognize the symptoms of trauma is so important. And there are other elements of this that I want to jump ahead, but I'll get to step by step here. So then you see respond. So we want to be able to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And so, previously to, a slide later that I'll be talking about when the World Health Organization recognized complex uh, PTSD as a diagnosis in itself, it was more that physicians and psychologists and other people who were in positions of diagnosing individuals who had experienced trauma, all they could come up with was diagnosing the symptoms. So what was recognized was anxiety or depression or antisocial behavior or various kinds of things, not understanding the underlying, processes that drive these various symptoms. And so to be able to integrate that knowledge, and this affects so many things, like on a policy level, as you can see here, then trauma itself not being recognized was then the research money went to depression. And of course, it's important to understand depression. It's a significant symptom that huge amount of people struggle with, but it's often a symptom of trauma. And if we don't address the underlying trauma and just address the symptom, we're limited in our ability to provide adequate care. And so, and you can see procedures and practices as well. It's like it changes how we work with these very significant symptoms that human beings struggle with to understand the underlying factors. And as you'll come to see in the course of this weekend, that the importance that I placed and that we place in NARM on, not just dealing with symptoms. I've already talked about it a little bit, but you'll see a lot more that it's, symptoms are something to be listened to, not simply just to be rid of. And then the final one that you see there is resisting re-traumatization. Uh, this is more challenging than it can seem sometimes because, there are so many different levels of experience. And often it is, not always, but often it is, trauma is transmitted through the parents. But it's important to remember that the parents are in a larger matrix of community, and that matrix of community is in a country, and that country is part of a world, so that as I start talking about environmental failure a little bit later, you'll see that all of these elements come into play, including elements like intergenerational trauma. And there are other pieces that we also need to know about too, that, for example, it's much easier to work with somebody who is had a trauma and it's over. It's much more challenging and requires other elements from us when a person is still living in a traumatic situation. And so with, you know, systemic issues, like when we're talking about systemic racism that's current, and, you know, it's a different, it presents different challenges for us as clinicians to work with, because the trauma is still going on, or a child that's still living in an abusive family, for example. We have to treat the whole family. We can't just treat the child who's the one expressing the symptoms. So there's a lot of things for us to keep in mind as we address the trauma, developmental trauma in particular, in all the forms that it takes, to be very mindful of the ever broadening context and contexts that we find trauma in. I mean, just think about in terms of, you know, like being born during COVID, you know, that in itself, a worldwide phenomenon, and how that, you know, represents an environmental failure. Then, of course, you know, how that impacts the community and impacts the schools and impacts the family, the parents, all of these things. So they're, you know, it's multi-layered, and it's just important for us, you know, to recognize the scope of all of this. So I just wanted to put that out there, to that we're not here to try and oversimplify what are often complex dynamics, but there are, and what I hope to be, you know, presenting to you, are certain um, organizing principles that can help us begin to address these in whatever our profession is.